Well, good morning, everybody, and thank you for being here on Father's Day. And what a great day it is today, and we're going to have a little Bible study this morning. And I want to encourage you to participate in this Bible study, and if you look on the right-hand bottom of your screen, you'll see a chat button. So as we go through this, it's just like Sunday school. I might pose a question. You can type in your answers or your responses right there. So when I had to think about what kind of topic to pick for Father's Day, and I think about all of the background and all of the different great stories there are in the Bible, one has always jumped out at me, and it's the one about Abraham and his son Isaac and what God asked him to do. And so that's kind of the baseline for our Bible study today. If you have your Bible with you, you can turn to Genesis chapter 22, and we'll be looking at verses 1 through 18 this morning. So, let's look right quick at Genesis chapter 22, verse 1. And it says, "Sometime later God tested Abraham, and he said to him, 'Abraham.' 'Here I am,' he replied." Now I want to stop right there. What I found interesting about this verse right here is you can tell that God and Abraham, they have a one-on-one type of relationship. They know each other on first name basis, and you can tell they communicate regularly. God just said, "Abraham," and he said, "Here I am." Wouldn't that be awesome if we had that kind of relationship with God where we talk to him so regularly that we could hear him, and when he calls our name, we say, "Here I am. Give me my marching orders. What do you need me to do?" You know, I think we all desire and strive to live a life that way. And Abraham, this shows you the kind of man that Abraham is, because he had that kind of relationship with God. Let's look at some other verses right quick. Let's look at verse 2, 3, and 4, and it says, "Then God said, 'Take your son, your only son, whom you love, Isaac, and go to the region of Moriah. Sacrifice him there as a burnt offering on a mountain I will show you.' Early the next morning, Abraham got up and loaded his donkey, and he took with him 2 of his servants and his son Isaac. When he had cut enough wood for the burnt offering, he set out for the place God had told him about. On the 3rd day, Abraham looked up and saw the place in the distance." Wow. So God says, "Abraham," and he says, "Here I am. Give me my marching orders." And God says, "Okay, here's your marching orders. Take your son, your only son, and you're going to go to this place, and you're going to sacrifice him." Now, there's no mention in Genesis here about Abraham arguing with God, bargaining with God. You know, I'm sure this hit Abraham like a ton of bricks. He's trying to process all this information. I mean, what would you do if you were in that situation? That would be the ultimate test of faith. But he didn't argue. And when we look at verse 3 here, it says, early the next morning, Abraham got up and he loaded his donkey and he went. And he just went. He just loaded the donkey, you know, and took off. Now let's think about the conversation that Abraham must have had with his wife Sarah. Do you think he talked to Sarah about this at all? Because I think if he did, Sarah would have said, "No, absolutely not. You are not going to be taking our son off and go sacrifice our son. This is not a father-son trip like I was envisioning. Y'all not going to go out and go fish or, you know, go out and enjoy nature. You're going out to sacrifice our kid. Bad idea." So I bet he didn't tell her. There's some other interesting things in here, though. If you see there in verse 3, it says, when he had enough wood cut for the burnt offering, he cut the wood before he left. Isn't that interesting? So he probably knew this region that he was going to, because God told him he was going to go to the region of Moriah. I'm not sure if I'm saying that right or not, but he's going to this region, so he probably knows that it's kind of a desolate area that's not going to have wood, because you wouldn't pack up for a big journey to go sacrifice and carry all your wood with you. At least I wouldn't think that you would do that. And so he must have known that there were no trees there. So when you think about this, there's no trees there, probably sparse vegetation, and it's not going to be an ideal location to find the lamb for a sacrifice. That's not the type of environment sheep typically want to hang out in. So he probably knew that ahead of time. Then it says that in verse 4, in verse 3, it says he took 2 of his servants with him and his son Isaac. When he cut enough wood for the burnt offering, he set out for the place that he had told him. And then in verse 4, it says, on the 3rd day, Abraham looked up and saw the place in the distance. So on the 3rd day, that meant it took them, they traveled on donkeys. That's going to mean that they spent 2 nights somewhere. Probably camping, out on the ground. If you've ever done that, that's a lot of fun. You build a fire. Great conversations around campfires. I've had some of the most important and memorable conversations with people around campfires. But just think about what could Abraham possibly want to talk about these 2 nights at these campfires. If you knew that you only had 2 or 3 days left with your only son, what kind of conversations would you be having with him? They would be very intentional, I would think. What state of mind would you be in during that time? I would think you'd be experiencing a lot of grief. I would think you'd be scared. You'd be confused. This is pretty serious pretty quickly. And Abraham knows, but nobody else knows. So if you have some thoughts on that, enter them in the chat on the bottom right-hand side. I'd love to hear what your thoughts are on what would you do in that situation, and what do you think that was like, those few nights that they were spending together. Let's look at verse 5 right quick. Verse 5 says, he said to his servants, stay here with the donkey while I and the boy go over there. We will worship, and then we will come back to you. Now, I've heard this talked about by different scholars, biblical scholars, and different ways. But I think that this is important right here when he says, we will worship, and then we will come back to you. What is he trying to say here? Is he being tricky? Trying to trick the guys at the donkey? I don't think so. I don't think Abraham was a tricky guy. But I think that he, even when it looked bleak, Abraham was going to be obedient to God's plan because he knew he had one. And so he knew somehow, some way, that him and that boy would come back. that's just my personal interpretation of that second "we" in that verse right there. I know different people have different interpretations of that, but he did say we will come back. So we're going to play this little game. It's called Quiz the Pastor. And so here's our first quiz question. Brother Stewart, what do you think of that second "we" in that passage?
We read, I mean, if it's okay for us to read forward into the New Testament, in Hebrews, it talks about Abraham being a man of faith, and though he didn't quite understand how it was going to happen, somehow he was trusting God that he would raise him from the dead, or whatever that took. So that's I think he was speaking in faith, and that's pretty important, pretty powerful.
Yeah, so I'll say it again. Even when it looked bleak, even when it looked like there was going to be no way out of this, Abraham was still obedient to God's plan. And he was obedient to God's plan because he knew he had one. He knew God had a plan. All right, let's look at verse 6 through 8. It says, Abraham took the wood for the burnt offering and placed it on his son Isaac. Now, when he says this, he means he put it on him to carry up there to where they were going to do the sacrifice. So that tells me it wasn't just a little bit of wood. It wasn't like, here, hold your arms out, I'm going to give you a few sticks of wood. This was enough wood that he had to load him up. He was probably wearing something, or had some kind of, I'm imagining some type of clothing that would help him carry that. And he himself carried the fire and the knife. That's Abraham. So Abraham carried the fire and the knife. Isaac carried all the wood. And the two of them went on together. Isaac spoke up and said to his father Abraham, he said, Father? Yes, my son, Abraham replied. The fire and wood are here, Isaac said, but where is the lamb for the burnt offering? Abraham answered, God himself will provide the lamb for the burnt offering, my son. And the two of them went on together. So, do you think when Abraham answered his son, God himself will provide the lamb for the burnt offering, my son, do you think he meant an actual lamb? Or do you think that is a metaphor? This is a great time for us to play the second round of Let's Quiz the Pastor.
I think at this point, again, if you go back and we read ahead in Hebrews 11, it says that Abraham reasoned that God could raise the dead. So he's thinking, okay, somehow God is going to provide, and I think it is a metaphor, and Abraham is speaking. He doesn't know all that he's saying at that point, but this is a great picture of Jesus being the lamb that was sacrificed for all of us, and God has given us an example of what does it take to provide for all of us, and God eventually sacrifices his own son on the altar for us. So I think Abraham, it's two things going on at the same time. He's speaking prophetically, and yet he's saying to something that Isaac would understand. God will take care of it, and God will provide what we need.
So you've heard what my thoughts on this, and now you've heard the pastor's thoughts on this, and you may have some thoughts of your own. And we'd be interested to hear what those thoughts are, and you can enter it in that chat box in the bottom right. So now let's look at verse 9. And it says, when they reached the place God had told him about, Abraham built an altar there and arranged the wood on it. He bound his son Isaac and laid him on the altar on top of the wood. Okay, so all the time that Abraham was building this altar, he was thinking about sacrificing his only son. And you know, whenever I stop and I remind myself about the great months that we spent building our church, you know, when we built that, we were happy, we were motivated, and we were focused because we knew that this facility would be used to bring others to Christ, to show love for them, to them. We knew people would get to come here and get to experience Christ here. And we had a certain mood or a certain attitude when we were building this because it was a positive thing. Abraham knew his son was fixing to be sacrificed at his own hand. And I bet you he did not have that same type of attitude as he was building that altar. I bet you he built it, you know, as perfect as he could, but his heart was breaking as he was building it. His mind was all in a state of probably confusion, sadness. I can only imagine, you know, what's going on in his mind. You know, I enjoy building different things, and part of it is the challenge of building something, but there's always an end goal, you know, like how is this going to be used when it's finished? And that's kind of what drives us to build different things, is because either we're going to use it or somebody else is going to use it, and it's going to be used in this manner, and this will be so much fun when it's finished. Or, you know, I know Stuart built an outdoor kitchen not too long ago at his place, and you know, as he's building it, he's probably thinking about the thick, juicy steaks he's going to get to cook on there, and all the pancakes that he's going to get to make. And you know, that attitude when you're building something means everything. And here, Abraham is building something that's God's told him, you're going to sacrifice your son on. And so that takes it to a whole different arena. And then if you look in verse 9, it says he bound his son, he tied him up. Okay, at this time it's estimated that Abraham was about 112 years old, and that Isaac was about 12. And there's no mention of struggle at all in this. And so I'm trying to imagine a 112-year-old person taking a 12-year-old and tying them up, and there not being any resistance at all. Because at 12 years old, you're smart enough at that point, you can put two and two together. There's no lamb, I'm carrying the wood, now he's tying me up, this is not looking good. But there's no mention of any, he didn't have to chase him down, you know. It just says he bound him up and put him on there. And so the way I see this verse right here is Isaac totally trusted his father. Even when it looked bleak, he trusted his father totally. And where did he learn this trust? He learned this trust from watching Abraham trust God. He watched him in the 12 years that he was alive. He watched Abraham live a faithful life. And as a father, on Father's Day, we need to think about the amazing responsibility that God has given us, fathers, to be gifted to being able to be leaders of our family and with raising our kids. Because just as it was important to Isaac to see those qualities in his father, it's that important for our children to see those qualities in us. And not just some of the time, and not just most of the time, but all of the time. So do our children see our faith? Are our children firsthand witnesses to our relationship with Christ? Those are some questions that every once in a while we have to ask ourselves, and I'll be the first to admit I don't always do that as good as I would like to. And but it's something to take and something to consider. Is our kids are learning what faithfulness looks like from us. So how about Abraham? How about him? Well, he was ready and willing to follow through at this point, and his faith and trust meter is at 100%. It's all the way up there. And I have a hard time imagining this moment in time right here, right before he picks up the knife. So let's read about that. This is verse 10 through 12. It says, "Then he reached out his hand and he took the knife to slay his son. But the angel of the Lord called out to him from heaven, 'Abraham, Abraham.' 'Here I am,' he replied. 'Do not lay a hand on the boy,' he said. 'Do not do anything to him. Now I know that you fear God, because you have not withheld from me your son, your only son.'" So Abraham grabs the knife and he's ready to go through with it. And notice in verse 11 it says, "The angel of the Lord," which is God, he calls out to him twice. So why do you think he called out to him twice? Well, I think it's because he knew that Abraham was probably all ramped up. You know, he's had 2 nights of emotion. You know, he's just tied up his son. He's got him on top of the wood. He got wood all around him. He's fixing to kill him and then set him on fire. And so when he pulls back that knife, he doesn't, you know, his mind is in some altered state. And so God calls his name twice. And because he wants to get his attention. And consider this. Get ready, because we're fixing to play Stump the Pastor again. Consider this. Isaac, who is tied on top of this wood, also hears God say, "Abraham, Abraham, do not lay a hand on this boy." Don't you think that Isaac learned a lot about his father and about God at that moment? Don't you think that Isaac would pass this story down his lineage, and that it would affect the type of father that he would ultimately become in the future? Stuart, have you ever considered that Isaac would hear those words, or do you think only Abraham could hear those words?
That's a great question.
We may be winning on Stump the Pastor with this question.
You may win this one. Honestly, in my mind, I have always thought that just Abraham is the one that heard. And I may be jumping ahead. Well, because that reading ahead, I noticed that when he hears the voice, what's he looking at? And God says, don't kill your son. He's looking at Isaac, and so that's where all of his focus and attention is, and that may be very well again why God has to say it twice, Abraham, Abraham, because he's going to be obedient, but his eyes are, I would have a hard time looking at my son. Sometimes I picture him, putting his hand over his eyes, but at that point he's just looking at Isaac. But if you, again, we read ahead, Isaac in the future doesn't have any kind of struggles with trusting God on issues like this. So he's apparently learned a very powerful lesson on what he's been through in this.
And kind of learned this lesson at the hands of his father.
Yes.
Usually when we talk about at the hands of your father, it's in a negative context, but this one comes out different. So let's look at verse 13 and 14. It says, Abraham looked up, and there in a thicket he saw a ram caught by its horns. He went over and he took the ram and he sacrificed it as a burnt offering instead of his son. So Abraham called that place, "The Lord will provide." And to this day it is said, "On the mountain of the Lord it will be provided." So when things look the darkest and we think that there's no way that we can get out of this terrible mess that we've got ourselves in, God always seems to have a plan to help us through. Sometimes it takes patience, and sometimes it takes a lot of years for us to see that plan. But don't forget, this ram showed up in a bush in a place that wasn't supposed to have sheep. God also made it to where Abraham didn't have to go catch this sheep. God already caught it for him. Can you imagine how wild this sheep would have been out there in the middle of nowhere? It would have been impossible to catch this ram. And don't miss this little important tidbit of info. In verse 13, it said the ram was caught by the horns. Now, why do you think that was so important? Well, if you think about it, and you consider it a little bit, if the ram would have been caught anywhere else on its body, it would have been damaged somehow. It would have been blemished somehow. And it would not have been feasible or acceptable for a sacrifice. That's pretty amazing in itself right there. And that's why in verse 14, Abraham called the place, "The Lord will provide." He truly provided for Abraham that day, but he will provide for us too if we follow Abraham's example of being obedient and faithful. So let's look at verse 15 through 18 right quick. It says, "The angel of the Lord called Abraham from heaven a second time, and he said, 'I swear by myself, declares the Lord, that because you have done this, and you have not withheld your son, your only son, I will surely bless you and make your descendants as numerous as the stars in the skies and the sand on the seashore. Your descendants will take possession of the cities of their enemies, and through your offspring all the nations on the earth will be blessed because you have obeyed me.'" God rewards the obedient and the faithful, and he follows through on his promises. And if you would like to study more about Abraham and how God fulfilled his promises, then keep reading in Genesis. Chapter 25 says that Abraham lived to be 175 years old. Just imagine what he must have witnessed over those 175 years. Thank goodness that God would never ask us today to sacrifice our one and only Son. I'm not sure if I could do that. The reason that He won't ask us to sacrifice our Son is because He loves us so much that He sacrificed His own Son for us, His one and only Son, so that we wouldn't have to. What He saved Abraham from having to go through, He went through Himself just for us. So I'd like for you to take some time this week to think about fatherhood and its awesome responsibilities. Think about the love of our Father and everything He's done for us. And who needs to hear your story this week? When God places somebody in your path, I pray that you have the courage to share your life story and what God's done in your life. And I can't wait until we're all back together on Sunday morning getting to do Bible study. But until then, don't let there be dust on the cover of your Bible. Keep studying God's Word, and His promises are real. He wants to teach you something every day. So until next time, God bless and happy Father's Day.